The Latino Torah Center presents the Chabura Online, a community of like-minded individuals who are learning about Judaism and exploring topics related to Jewish living and coming from a crypto-Jewish background. In this week's show, our guest is Juan Marcos Bejarano Gutierrez, a graduate from Siegal College and Spertus Institute of Jewish Learning and Leadership. He's a rabbi who received ordination from Yeshiva Mesilat Yesharim. He lives in Dallas and is a researcher in Spanish Jewish history. He's the author of Secret Jews, The Complex Identity of Crypto-Jews and Crypto-Judaism. So as part of our exploration in the history of Spanish Jewry and their persecution, we're going to do part 2 with him. Last week we heard from David Ramirez, another researcher, and we're going to see from his perspective, dealing with the history and the surviving communities in Latin America. So Dr. Bejarano Gutierrez, tell us about your interest in Spanish Jewish history.
Hello, David. Thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. The subject of Crypto-Judaism and Sephardic history in general has been a fascination of mine for more than 20 years. As I always relate to people, it's a personal story because it affects my family. But it's also a personal story in a different sense in that I work with individuals that are descendants of crypto-Jews. They're descendants of Anusim or Conversos. And many of them are struggling with different issues of identity, of faith. There are questions about Judaism. There are questions about Christianity and so forth. And what I find fascinating is that many of them reflect in their personal experiences the kinds of challenges that Sephardic Jews and crypto-Jews of centuries past faced as well. So it's sort of an interesting bridge between the past and the present, and how history is a very important topic for those who are interested in anything related to the Jewish experience.
What are some myths that people will perpetuate about these individuals?
Well, I think I would say that they're more misunderstanding than necessarily myths. I think that what I do find sometimes is that there's a tendency among certain groups or certain individuals to conflate different ideas about Jewish identity and then about the Sephardic experience. So it's not something intentional, but this is the kind of information that they read on the internet. So it's one of the challenges that we face because there's so much information that's available online. People don't understand the concept of peer review. They don't understand the differences between scholarship and sort of opinion. For example, there was a family that I got to meet this last Shabbat. They came to a service that I was leading, and they were from a crypto-Jewish background. And we talked a little bit. And I was explaining to them that, the challenge of the scholar or of the researcher is to be open-minded, but ultimately to base themselves on provable facts. We can state our opinion, we can provide conjecture about certain things that we don't know historically, but we always sort of have to have a foundation based off of things that we can verify. So one of the things he had mentioned, for example, was the common claim in the book of Obadiah about the exile or the exiles that are in Sepharad. And so I told him that, from an archaeological perspective, we know that Jews lived in the Iberian Peninsula from, the 3rd and 4th century because we have tombstones and things of that nature that testify to that. Now, it's likely that they were there before, perhaps from the 1st century, maybe even farther back, but we don't know. And so he was a little bit shocked at the fact that I said that, and I said, listen, it's like a court case. We have to bring our evidence, and we can sort of craft a story, and we can provide options or possibilities, but we sort of have to rely ultimately on the facts that we can present. And once I said that, I think he understood. And I think it's really that, it's the lack of understanding, the lack of knowledge, and the tendency to just believe anybody that comes on the scene and proclaims himself as an expert in the field. And so I think that's really the biggest challenge, is that there's a lot of quote-unquote experts that really have not studied history. They don't know Jewish studies. They don't know halakha, and quite frankly, they may not even have a methodology to be able to approach those issues to begin with. So I think those are the biggest challenges that I've seen so far.
And for our audience, to be clear on things, let's make sure that we define our terms. So halakha would be the Jewish law that is active in the Jewish community, like their practice and the different regulations on how to live. Is that what it is?
Yes, that's correct. So what I try to do is I try to essentially combine both worlds in the sense that I look at myself as someone who loves history. I mean, I've studied that at the master's level, the doctoral level. Even in my rabbinic studies, there was a great emphasis placed on historical development. So I can try to approach this from a scholarly perspective. And some of the readers of my book, Secret Jews, they'll tell me, they find it to be, there's not an agenda there. It's unbiased. That's certainly my goal. And then if there's an interest on the individual to reconnect with their Jewish past, then I would sort of work within the realm of halakha and try to teach them about Jewish beliefs and practices and so forth. So for me, they're part of one world, but depending on the individual or the audience, I can try to separate those and then sort of present what I feel to be an honest opinion, and sort of state the fact, and then I can sort of state what I might personally believe on a particular issue. But that's sort of my goal is to be honest with people and lay the historical and the religious and philosophical issues on the table for them to consider when they approach this subject.
Well, here on The Mystic and the Skeptic, we want to hear as many opinions and perspectives as possible. So last time we talked to Mr. Ramirez about the history of how it all started. Let's go back in time to the beginning of this, and from your perspective, can you paint us a picture of the political and social climate in Spain at that time and how it developed up until now?
I'll try to be extremely brief, but I mean, essentially, Jews have lived in the Iberian Peninsula for more than 1,000 years, and what's fascinating to me is that uninterrupted existence of Jewish life in Spain and in Portugal or in the Iberian Peninsula was longer than Jewish life in the land of Israel. The Jews in the land of Israel have undergone the exile in Babylon, of course the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 CE and subsequent dispersions until the land was effectively depopulated of the majority of Jewish residents. And so the Iberian Peninsula for Jews was unique because of the longevity of the experience and life there. Jews lived there during the Roman period. They lived there during the rise of the Visigoths, the Germanic tribes that had in part brought about the downfall of the Roman Empire, at least in the West. They lived there during the Islamic conquest of the peninsula. And then as the Muslim Caliphate fell and it became divided into different city-states, the taifas, Jews lived in this changing environment where many of them began to move into Christian kingdoms. So they really experienced the Roman world, the Visigothic world, the Islamic world, and then the Christian Reconquista, the reconquest of the peninsula from Islamic control. These emerging Christian kingdoms. So they really tasted and experienced, very complex political, economic, and social changes. And most people have a tendency to look at that period of time, as this sort of golden age. But I always remember the words of Rabbi Byron Sherwin of blessed memory. He said that it may have been golden, but it was probably golden only for a few hundred individuals, and those are the individuals that we typically read about, the great philosophers and poets and grammarians. But obviously, it was a better existence for the average Jew than it would have been in in France or in Germany or in other parts of the world. But it wasn't this kind of idyllic setting that people like to paint, where there were no issues. There was conflict that Jews experienced under Islamic rule, and there was plenty of violence and persecution that they experienced in the Christian world. So I'll just say one more thing before turning it over to you, is that by the 14th century, the Jewish communities of Castile and Aragon were really at their height. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews. They were doing well, you could say financially, politically. It was a generally successful community. And of course, all of that changed with the onslaught of violence that occurred in 1381. And for the next 100 years, we have a period of turmoil within the Jewish community because of the rise of these conversos, of these converts to Christianity, these Jewish converts to Christianity, who become this middle ground between the established Jewish community and then the established Christian community. And these conversos become, the focal point of Christian policy toward Jews, and also, in some sense, I think, reflective of the modern-day Jewish experience. And what I mean by that is that conversos were living in two worlds. They were baptized Christians who continued to have Jewish family. They lived in the same neighborhoods. They ate the same foods. They often celebrated Passover. They kept Jewish customs with their family, but they were legally Christian. And my point in saying that they're reflective of the modern era is that you can think about the American experience in the sense that Jews today are extremely influenced by the non-Jewish culture around them, to the extent that they don't even realize how much they've absorbed American culture and American perspectives on faith and ideology. So it's a very interesting point of connection to the modern period, and of course it was a very important concern for the church and the monarchs in the late 14th and into the 15th and 16th centuries in Castile and Aragon.
How is this connected to the history of anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that there's two elements that we have to consider, and that is that Christianity I think we could argue from the beginnings of the 2nd century of the Common Era, and some would argue even before then, but we begin to see elements of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism fairly clearly in the 2nd century among the church fathers, the ones that, at least according to the church, followed the early Christian community, the apostles, and that anti-Jewish sentiment begins to build over the next several centuries. Jews experienced that kind of oppression under the Visigothic kingdom, and it's very interesting because many Jews, of course, were forced to convert under the Visigoths, but the fact that they were from Jewish background continued to distinguish them and to separate them from the rest of the Christian community. And we see that pattern continue on into the medieval period, well beyond 1391, when even if an individual was a quote-unquote sincere Catholic, the very fact that they were tainted by Jewish ancestry made them suspect. And so we have this idea that Judaism is not simply a belief, but it's actually a genetic disorder, so to speak. And what I mean by that is that individuals who were from Jewish backgrounds were thought to be inclined toward keeping Jewish practices and Jewish customs, but there was something within them that was innate, as far as many old Christians were concerned, that forever branded them as suspect. And so in the 1449, there's a famous incident that occurred in the city of Toledo. Many Jews who had converted, and these conversos had become prominent in public office. And there were accusations that many of them continued to practice Judaism secretly. Some of them were not so secret about it. Sometimes There were accusations that they were very flagrant in their observance. And the economic issues, the social advancement, the political advancement often brought the ire of old Christians. And what happened in Toledo and eventually spread throughout Castile and into the Kingdom of Spain over the next 100 and plus years was the incorporation and the adoption of the limpieza de sangre laws, which basically said that if you were of a Jewish background, and I think they would argue so many levels of descendants, I can't remember offhand, they would consider you to be suspect, and you would be your Christianity was suspect, and in some cities you were not legally admissible to become a public servant or become a cleric or to assume certain positions. Now, those limpieza de sangre laws were often flouted. Sometimes individuals would, of course, fake documents to prove that they were of old Christian lineage. The king and King Ferdinand, King Isabella, had many Jewish courtiers in their service. Many of their secretaries and historians and so forth were conversos and were known to be conversos. But every city reacted differently to the rise of the converso class, and the idea that Judaism was no longer just a set of beliefs became ingrained in Spanish society. And I think in that sense you can link it to the rise of modern anti-Semitism, where regardless of what faith a Jew practices, their ethnicity or their Jewish blood or their DNA, so to speak, forever bonds them to the Jewish community. And so we do have, I believe, the rise of anti-Semitism through the Converso experience.
In your book, The Secret Jews, The Complex Identity of Crypto-Jews and Crypto-Judaism, on page 40, you mentioned that Jews at that time were wearing distinctive clothing. Tell us more about that.
Well, the distinctive clothing was brought about by the church and the monarchs. And the concern was that Jews looked the same as Christians. I mean, they had dressed the same. There were cases in which they might have been in neighborhoods that were mixed. They lived and they operated in society without restraint in many cases. But because of the rise of the converso class, the ability to distinguish a quote-unquote converso from a Jew was almost impossible. And so what was adopted by the Kingdom of Aragon, for example, in the late 14th century, was the institution of distinctive clothing, badges, for example, to distinguish non-Christian Jews or Jews who had not converted to Christianity from conversos and hence from Christians. There was a great deal of consternation over the possibility that there may have been, romantic relationships between Jews and Christians. It's something that we see throughout the literature of the period. And so the monarchs wanted to ensure that there would be a clear distinction and delineation between these communities. Again, to what extent did all Jews do that? There may have been local exemptions, or they may have, found ways to circumvent that. But the idea of distinctive clothing goes back centuries before, where badges were introduced, by the church in different areas. So the effect or the impact of Jews on Christians was something that the church considered to be a pressing matter. And so they had to find, in their mindset, they had to find a way of defending the Christian community against the influence of Jews and Judaism.
Tell us about the process of forced conversion. I was shocked to find out what they did to Jewish children at that time.
Well, of course, in 1391 and in other instances, there were mass riots that spread first in Seville and then throughout Castile and then through Aragon. The Kingdom of Portugal was spared that due to the efforts of their king, but entire families were killed. Other families, if there was often like a division within the family itself, part of the family may have converted, they may have submitted to baptism. There were cases in which the grandparents may have remained Jewish, and the children and the grandchildren would convert. But the church saw children as sort of the key in many ways. And at the end of the 15th century, one of the plans that was presented to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella was a separation between converted fathers and mothers from their children, because for a century, Conversos had lived, quote unquote, as Christians, but they had not received extensive education in Christian beliefs. Their attendance was minimal in terms of Christian functions. There wasn't really a lot of enthusiasm on the part of the church and clerics to teach them. But the idea that Jewish practices remained part of Converso identity is very easy to understand. They hadn't become Christians, willfully for the most part. They lived among their families. They had connections, cousins, and so forth that had not converted. So there was an ability to maintain some Jewish connection. And so the proposal that was made to King Ferdinand and Isabella, especially in the wake of approximately another 50,000 Jews that chose to convert and stay in Spain in 1492, was that their children be separated from them and raised in old Christian families. And the idea, of course, there was that only supervised visits would be allowed, so that the old Christians and the church could monitor the influence of parents who had been born as Jews on the children. Now, that ultimately was not adopted, but it shows you the extent to which Judaism was considered a threat, the likelihood of Conversos reverting back to Judaism, how likely that was perceived. And then it also shows you something else, is even after Jews had been expelled from the peninsula in 1492, there was an acknowledgement on the part of the Inquisition and on the part of the monarchs that Judaism could still be observed in some form or fashion for generations. I mean, it had existed for 100 years under attack, but Conversos had the reinforcement of Jews who had not converted. But I think the fact that they were willing to consider these kinds of things reveals how strong Jewish identity remained among the Conversos, that they would even consider this. So I think that's quite telling.
In your book, you mentioned that there was a couple of instances where some of the persecuted people took up arms against their foes. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes. In 1449 in Toledo, and in various cases, I think it's 1467, 1473, there are various cities, I think in Ciudad Real. I don't have my notes in front of me, so I apologize. But, Conversos were not sitting back and allowing old Christians to riot against them without any consequence. There's a description of a battle that took place where I think there was something like 300 Conversos that formed like a militia, and they basically threatened the rest of the town that if any one of them was touched, they would react violently. There's cannon involved. There's another occurrence in the book that I talk about actual siege engines being used. I mean, it's like a story. I mean, it's a novel, for lack of a better term. It's amazing the extent to which Conversos were willing to take up arms. I also discuss in the book, of course, I think a little bit of information on the action of some Conversos against the establishment of the Inquisition. There's the murder of Pedro Arbues. There's different assassination plots that are planned against other inquisitors. I mean, it's a community that is striving to protect itself. And if the church and if the monarchs were not willing to defend them against, perhaps real or false accusations, many of them were willing to take up arms and defend themselves. So it's interesting, and your question leads to another point, is that by the 1450s and 60s, many Conversos supported a strong monarchy. And they supported a strong monarchy because they believed that the monarchs would be able to protect them and the Jewish community. So the Jews who had not converted were in favor of a strong monarchy. Conversos wanted that because it would protect them and their rights. And yet, what's amazing is that the fact that they wanted a strong monarchy would ultimately be their demise. And what do I mean by that? If it had not been for Jewish and Converso support, at least one could argue, for King Ferdinand and Isabella, the decision of 1492 would not have been possible. And what I mean by that is that because there were so many civil wars that had taken place in Castile and in Aragon and so forth, the support that was given to strong monarchs ultimately allowed an edict of expulsion to become a possibility. So I guess you would say it's ironic that in voting or in supporting, supporting the strong kingship and queenship, they ultimately ceded the destruction of the Jewish community in Spain. So it's a tragedy that you often find repeated in Jewish history.
You mentioned in one of our conversations that people are fascinated with the Inquisition. How is this so?
Well, I think that many people are mistaken about what the Inquisition was about. Most people that I talk to that are not familiar with Inquisitional history do not understand that the Spanish Inquisition and of course the Portuguese Inquisition, when it was established, their focal point, or their focus in the first several decades of their existence was specifically on the threat of Judaizing among Conversos. The Inquisition, of course, has its seeds in the early medieval period. It began as a tribunal to root out the Albigensian heresy, and you can even find earlier tribunals that existed during the times of the Emperor Theodosius and Justinian. But the Spanish Inquisition was unique in the sense that it had the apparatus of the state behind it. Before that period, you would have what we call the Papal Inquisitions. They were usually headed by a local bishop. They could obviously perform investigations, and what we see in the immediate aftermath of the violence of 1391, especially in the Kingdom of Aragon, we see inquisitors, local bishops undertaking activities in conjunction with the King of Aragon to root out Judaizing. The punishments were usually not as severe. There might be financial penalties, things of that nature, but the Inquisition was active. But what we see under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella is an Inquisition that is a very highly tuned bureaucracy. It's a fine-tuned machine. It's amazing from just a historical perspective, the extent of documentation that they provided. The investigations and the sessions, the court sessions, if you will, were sealed for the most part. And so when we look at the amount of notes that we're taking, it's truly amazing, because whatever we think about the legitimacy of the depositions or the confessions or the questions that were asked of the individuals, the amount of notes that were taken, the discussions are copious. It's very large volumes of information. And of course the Inquisition had tremendous authority and power to be able to root out what they considered to be the number one threat to the kingdom, which was this Judaizing, this heresy. In subsequent decades, after having prosecuted thousands and thousands of Conversos, they began to shift their attention toward the emergence of Protestantism, bigamy, witchcraft, homosexuality, other things of that nature. But what we see in the 1500s and again in the 1600s is we have periods of the resurgence of Judaizing as a major point of concern. And so what's fascinating is that, of course, the Inquisition doesn't end until the 19th century. By that point, the focus of Judaizing, or the topic of Judaizing was not really a primary concern, but it's amazing to realize that an institution that began in Spain in 1478, or depending on how you date it from its actual point of arrest, continued on until I think formally until 1834, 1821, different dates depending on when the final structure is closed. But it's something that lasts for centuries, and it's, like I said, it's often misunderstood. But the primary reason was Conversos, and I think that is what most people fail to realize.
So what is the evidence that shows that the expulsion happened for Jews not to have any influence on the Conversos?
Well, if you look at the edict of expulsion that was given by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, it specifically states that the expulsion is essentially the final solution, if you will, to the Converso problem. And what they say is that, I'm paraphrasing, we've had an Inquisition that has been active. They've documented that, Conversos are receiving help from non-converted Jews, in a variety of ways. They're being taught Judaism. The Inquisition has been, attacking this problem, but we realize that unless we remove the root of the problem, Judaizing will always be a challenge. And what's fascinating is that if you think about it, in 1391 you have these mass conversions. So by 1492, it's 100 years, and you're talking about second, third, fourth generation Conversos who are often connected to the Jewish community in one form or another. Now, that doesn't mean that they were, sort of Orthodox Jews as we would perceive them, but there is a point of Jewish connection. They may have been a Passover, they may have contributed money to a synagogue, they may have even chanced to go to a synagogue on Yom Kippur. There's different things that they did, but as long as Jews remain there, it was a very strong point of encouragement to Conversos to return. And I highlighted in Secret Jews various examples where, you have a family member who invites their Converso cousin to come over to their house to celebrate Passover, or they spend time with them, and of course they're eating kosher food, they're drinking kosher wine. It's something that reinforces the experience of being Jewish, and it's very interesting. I think you'll find this fascinating. One of the individuals that visited a service that we had at our home about a month ago, he had read, he was reading Secret Jews, and there was a quote that I had that, feasting or eating at a Jew's table was a tremendous experience for a Converso, because what they could theorize about Judaism, what they might read about it, what they might hear about it, was not the same as an experience in a Jew's home. They would recite the brachot, the blessings before the meal. They would eat kosher food. They would sing, if it was on Shabbat, they might sing Zemirot, or they might do the Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals. It would be a Jewish experience that was unequal to them. And what was fascinating to me was that this individual who, is coming from a crypto-Jewish background said that he felt the same thing. He ate with us. We davened, we prayed, we sang songs. He felt that he was living out something that he had read about, from the 14th and 15th centuries. So it was an amazing experience for those individuals to have the reinforcement and encouragement of Jews who had not converted, and it often motivated Conversos to leave the peninsula, to return to Judaism, and oftentimes, even if they didn't leave, to take very bold steps to maintain Jewish identity while they lived in Spain.
So how did the leaders of the Jewish community feel about these forced converts?
Well, I think that, like anything, there is it's a wide spectrum. I would say that if I had to describe it briefly, I would say that they were always open to conversos returning to Judaism. I think the extent of discussion on this topic is reflected in quite a few responsa. You know, these you have a community that is asked a question about a woman who is a converso woman who is married in Spain to another converso. You know, she has a ketubah, she leaves, and a community in North Africa, for example, might be asking, what do we do? You know, does she have to get a get? Does she have to get a legal divorce? Is the marriage valid to begin with? And you have these kinds of questions. You have questions about the kosher status of wine that is under the supervision of conversos. You have conversos writing questions about, what do I do in certain circumstances that, I have my non-Jewish neighbors, my Christian neighbors that are going to see what I'm eating. It's Passover. If I don't eat, if I eat chametz or if I eat leaven, is that acceptable? I mean, there's all kinds of correspondence that take place, and the very fact that these questions are being asked shows you that conversos were something that were important to the Jewish community. And I would suggest that in most cases you find a desire on the part of rabbis and communities to welcome them in, and to make allowances under Jewish law, to find scenarios where they can be flexible with Jewish law, to embrace them. And I'll give you one example. The problem of marriage was a great consideration, because you often had women fleeing the peninsula to join Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire or North Africa. And if the rabbis were to consider converso marriages valid, it was actually detrimental, because then the woman would be forced to get a divorce document from her husband, and of course that would entail physical and danger, but also the practicalities of undergoing a trip like that. In that period of time was also extremely complicated as well. So sometimes the rabbis make decisions that seem to be negative with regards or with respect to the Jewish identity of conversos, but they're actually beneficial, because their concern is to deal with the individual that has made it out, and not necessarily with the theoretical status of the conversos that had not made it out. In other cases, there's a incident that I recorded in the book where there was an individual in I can't remember if it was in Venice, but it was in the Italian peninsula, and he had fled the Iberian Peninsula. He was very sincere about Judaism. He contributed to the welfare of the synagogue. He prayed. He was extremely zealous, but he had not circumcised himself, because his plan was to return to the peninsula and essentially liquidate his assets, and of course, escape again. And there's actually a dialogue there between the rabbis as to whether this individual should be allowed to come up to the Torah and participate in the honors. And you have some disagreement there. And the disagreement is not specifically over this individual, but the message that it might send to others. But the very fact that they're having that conversation shows you that they're wanting to do everything to, encourage this individual to recognize that circumstances were complicated, and at the same time, they don't want to give like a get out of jail free card for conversos that were not willing to make a sacrifice. And so sometimes you find rabbis like Rabbi Mortera in Amsterdam who give these very harsh sermons about conversos who have stayed in the peninsula. If they don't repent, they're in dangers of the fires of hell. Things of that nature, and it strikes you as a very negative tone. But I think if you look at the context of what he and others wrote, he really wants to motivate these individuals to leave. And he wants them to get out to a place where they say, listen, it's going to be challenging, there's going to be sacrifice, but I need to make the effort to move and to leave, to get my family to come with me. There was an incident that I recorded in Secret Jews about a community in France. I think it was in Bayonne. They write to Amsterdam and they ask, we're not circumcised. Technically it's not legal for us to practice Judaism openly. We received a letter. We had a visitor that said basically we're cut off from Israel. We don't. If we're not circumcised, we're going to perish, etc. And there's a rabbi that responds to them. And on the one hand, he tells them, circumcision, Brit Milah, is not going to resolve all your problems. I mean, it's a sign of the covenant, but it's one component. As long as you continue to live, sort of this outward Catholic lifestyle, you're not going to be, for lack of a better term, saved. But at the same time, at the end of the letter, he says, what we do not wish for you to be cut off. We want, he's embracing them, even as he may be chastising them. They are part of the people of Israel, even if they are not in good standing. And I think that's what you see. You sort of this push and pull. They want to draw Conversos to Judaism, and they want them to return to the Jewish community. So I would say that overall it's positive. You're always going to find exceptions, but I think that the rabbis are focused on bringing Conversos back to the community.
According to our previous guests and others, the percentage of people who are Jewish descendants in Latin America is low. Can you give us some figures that support your perspective about the modern communities claiming Jewish heritage?
Well, I think that the issue that you have to start off with is, of course, what do we mean by Jewish? And obviously, there's the halachic perspective that someone who is born to a Jewish mother is a Jew in perpetuity. And of course, if there's an unbroken matrilineal line, then it doesn't matter that the individual, the ancestors, may have converted. But the difficulty that we have, of course, with individuals in Latin America or individuals who are claiming this Converso background is the question of documentation. So, some people, have argued that, we should look at the oral tradition, the practices of these individuals, their family, things that are distinctively Jewish, and I think that's a good starting point. I think that it's not an easy question, and I don't think that I think we should be very careful in doubting the assertions of individuals who are looking to return to the community of Israel. I think there have been plenty of circumstances where we have to recognize that there is, unfortunately, a political component involved in accepting Jews. Even individuals that choose to go through conversion often find that those conversions are not accepted. I've known individuals that have converted multiple times, and tragically, the conversions have not been accepted, even though they've been done in Orthodox settings. And so, when an individual comes to me and tells me they're from a Converso background, I take him at face value. But what I do is I see or I observe what the commitment of the individual is. And then if there are issues that need to be resolved, if there is a Brit Milah, circumcision that has to take place, or if there are marriage issues, things of that nature, then I try to explain sort of the requirements that are in place for these individuals. And so I think we have to realize that everybody is at a different place along their journey. And I think that, pushing away people who are not sincere, I think, is fine. But of course, it's difficult sometimes to judge that sincerity. We sort of have to take individuals on a case-by-case basis. I have personally not seen myriads of individuals claiming to be Converso backgrounds. So I know that others have claimed that, and they usually point to occurrences of churches in Latin America or something. But I think for the most part, those are isolated incidents. I think it's difficult to dismiss someone's claim without understanding where they're coming from and their personal history, the background, the oral traditions that they have. So I can't provide you with numbers, but I can only say that I think that claims that there are myriads of people out there claiming that they're Conversos is not something that I have seen. Maybe others have experienced that, but there might be some high-profile cases, and I think I've read maybe a story about a church in Colombia, but I don't see it as something widespread. Certainly not with the individuals that I have met and the ones that I continue to meet. It's usually ones and twos and a family here and a family there. There's a rabbi, Joseph Garcia, in Phoenix, Arizona, and I think he claims that he has helped about 400 people, and he has been doing this, probably 10 to 12 years or something like that. I mean, 400 sounds like a lot, but it's a relatively small number. I think in the context, in the big picture, it's very small, and most of those individuals, I think, are widespread. I mean, they're not just from Phoenix or something like that. I mean, it's across a large territory. So again, I think it's a small number of individuals that claim this because it's not something that is popular. I don't think there's a quote unquote benefit that people think there is. And it takes a lot of sacrifice and commitment to follow through with this, especially if you're looking to re-embrace Judaism from a religious perspective.
Can you tell us more about your organization and what are the options for the descendants of crypto-Jews in our day?
The organization that I have is called the Benei Anusim Center for Education, and it came about. It started as a blog a couple years ago. And I actually had people contact me through the blog. Some of them were local, and some of them were from within the state of Texas. Some of them were outside of the state of Texas and in other states, and even in other countries. And the focus of the center was to provide education, articles, links for people that were interested in learning about the crypto-Jewish experience from a historical perspective, to learn about it from a religious perspective, and then also to be a point of education for those that were interested in investigating Judaism religiously. And so the newest dimension to the organization has been publishing. Of course, my great focus is on specifically crypto-Jewish studies. That's where Secret Jews comes from. But I'm working on a book on the Inquisition, and then I've also focused on publishing short introductions to kosher, Jewish prayer, things of that nature that will eventually, God willing, be translated into Spanish. We have our first book that has just been translated. We just have to go through the setting, entering everything. It's been done manually, and so that's one dimension of the center. The second is really on a practical level. There are lectures that I give locally in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Lectures on different topics. Sometimes they're related specifically to Crypto-Judaism. A lot of the individuals that attend are interested in understanding Judaism better. So, for example, about a month ago, I gave an introduction to the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral law. And before that, I had talked about different types of Judaism. So it's a mixture of things that are specifically focused on the crypto-Jewish experience. Some are on the broader Sephardic experience. And then the other component is actually having Jewish events for individuals that are from this background. So, for example, we're having a Seder for people that I have met through the center. We have services right now that we're conducting approximately once or twice a month. We'll do Shacharit services, morning services on Shabbat. We'll do an occasional evening service for the end of Shabbat, Havdalah, things of that nature. We've done some Shabbat dinners in the past. So there's sort of multiple endeavors at work, and we're trying to sort of address each need as it presents itself. If somebody just has an interest in this area historically, then we have material that they can learn from. If there's an interest in individuals reconnecting with the Jewish community, then I try to help them out as a rabbi. And there are also individuals that are from Christian backgrounds that are not Conversos that simply learn about this. They're fascinated by it, and they want to have a deeper appreciation of Judaism and the Jewish people in general. So it becomes an excellent opportunity to build some interfaith bridges, help fight anti-Semitism, and give them a new appreciation for the complexity of the Hispanic experience. So those are things that we're working on, and I think you didn't mention it, but I'm a full-time engineer, so that takes most of my time. But these things are very important to me. I'm very passionate about them, and it just excites me to be able to connect with people in different cities, different states, different countries, and it's ones and twos, but it does add up, and it is fascinating to connect with other individuals that have this interest and this passion.
Before we close, can you just tell us a little bit about the politics and the issues that people face? I know you mentioned that you're trying to combat that and try to help people through it, but what's the overall climate nowadays? In your book, you mentioned that people being persecuted against all odds were able to keep some semblance of Judaism in their lives, and nowadays, with no persecution, we're still struggling with people becoming disenfranchised or even disinterested in religion altogether. So what are the things that people who find out about their ancestry, either through oral tradition or through their research, what are the things that they'll face from the get-go?
I wanted to start off answering your question by referring to Rav Kook, who's a very famous rabbi in the land of Israel, and he wrote something which I'm going to paraphrase, but he said that sometimes individuals are compelled, sometimes they're forced to certain behavior, to certain sin, because of their emotions, because of their circumstances, because of things that they effectively cannot control. And it was interesting to me that he used the image of the Hebrew word ones, this compulsion or this force to sort of have a compassion toward individuals that had commit a sin. And my point in saying that is that in our society today, there are circumstances which often compel individuals into decisions that they would not normally make. I was having a conversation with one individual who comes from a crypto-Jewish background, and he really hesitated in sharing this with some of his family because he anticipated that there would be conflict. That's an issue. I have other circumstances where there's conflict between a married couple. There's issues with the greater family. There's not an openness. Maybe the family is religiously devout. They might be Protestant or they might be Catholic, or they may not have any religious background, but they may have an element that in them that really shuns the Jewish community. So I think the most important challenge that people face is the familial one. The price or the cost of choosing a Jewish identity or re-embracing that with a family that is not supportive. I think that's the number one issue. I think the second issue is the simple fact that because of their Hispanic backgrounds, there oftentimes is not the kind of acceptance that is ideal within the established Jewish community. If they go, what I have seen personally, and it's not intended as a critique, but many of the families that I work with are socially and, for lack of a better term, they're very conservative in their family values. So they often go to progressive Jewish congregations, and even though they might be accepted, Jewishly on a certain level, they often struggle to identify with things that they're not accustomed to. And then if they go to more traditional or Orthodox settings, then they have their Jewishness questioned, and then they run into another problem. So it's almost like they don't have, there's not a place for them. If they go to the Orthodox, then their Jewishness is going to be discounted, and they'll have to convert. And along with that, there are all kinds of social, financial implications. I told a story on the blog recently about a Cuban family that I had met, very very nice family. They had just a big heart. They had adopted some children from Africa, and they wanted to reconnect with the Jewish community. They went to an Orthodox rabbi. They talked about their family background, and the rabbi was candid with them. I mean, on the one hand, it's like I have to give him some kudos for being honest from his perspective. But it was very devastating to them. I mean, he told them basically, I'm concerned about the multiracial aspect of your family. I want to think practically about who they're going to marry. And then there was a financial issue. They were not in a good financial position, and conversion for them was going to require a Jewish Orthodox day school that was going to cost $10,000 to $15,000 a piece, and I think they had something like 4 or 5 children. It was impossible for them to do that, and so that's one extreme. But I think that people that are embracing or rediscovering their past, their family backgrounds, they often don't realize the obstacles that they may face. So they may not be fleeing persecution from Spain, but they may be facing rejection by their family. They may be facing rejection by an established Jewish community. They may be facing financial difficulties. They may be facing, cultural, even linguistic issues. They're minorities within the United States, and then they're almost, in a sense, becoming minorities of the minorities by pursuing a Jewish identity. And sometimes that can be too much for some people to handle. And oftentimes it may be overwhelming. So I think that these are very real issues. They may not be violent in terms of the suffering that people face, but they're real nonetheless. And I think that what I hope to achieve is at least lend an ear to them and let them know that somebody understands, where they're coming from.
On a final note, there's a big section in your book about the people who were Conversos or crypto-Jews who were just so disenfranchised and so discouraged with religion altogether that they became the first skeptics and the people who kind of brought in naturalistic philosophy. And I came across the book Nothing Sacred by Douglas Rushkoff, where he talks about how nowadays religion is losing its relevancy. And you and I were talking about how sometimes because of politics or because of modern ideas, religion is kind of being segregated to the realm of scholars or of people on the fringes. So what aspect of the crypto-Jewish experience can help us understand the modern day struggle and the issues that all people deal with when it comes down to spiritual perspectives and religion in general?
I mean, I'll be honest, I think that's a very complex question, but I think that if we look back at the individuals, particularly in Amsterdam, for example, they had oftentimes, obviously Christian education. They were leaving Portugal or Spain. And the challenge for many of them was a view of Judaism that may have been different from what they had expected. Many times they were extremely educated, and so they may have resented the fact that, the rabbis who had not necessarily had the kind of university education that many of them had were, in this position of authority. And there was often an unwillingness on many of their, on the part of many of them to adapt to a very, rigorous environment. There were some individuals that converted to Protestantism within, the Amsterdam community, and of course, as you mentioned, there were some that were skeptic. And I think that it's important. One thing that I learned from Rabbi Sherwin of blessed memory is that unless individuals are taught why things are done and what they mean, there will always be less of an impetus or a sense of purpose in a person keeping their faith, whatever it is. And I think that what I'm trying to get at is the Conversos who made it out of the peninsula did so because their families, their parents, had struggled to maintain an awareness of who they were. They managed to pass an identity of faith to them, and they were willing to undergo suffering, financial loss, even potential capture by the Inquisition, because they really believed in what their families, their ancestors had given to them. It may have been imperfect, it may have been partial, it may have been flawed, but they gave them this idea that they were linked to the people of Israel, that they were Jews, and that they had an obligation to maintain that identity with them into the future. And so I think that unless Jews do something because they really believe it, Jewish identity will fade. And I think that it's interesting that someone like Baruch Spinoza or Benedictus Spinoza was actually an individual that grew up in the community. So sometimes you have these situations where an individual grows up in a religious context and still chooses to abandon it, still chooses to essentially leave the community. So it's not so clear cut sometimes. It's not just because an individual may not have that background, but even after having that background, certain individuals find other perspectives alluring. And it's something that we can't necessarily diagnose, but on an individual basis. But I think that the Converso experience illuminates our understanding of our situation in America and of Western Jewry in the sense that we have a struggle to live in two worlds, and how we integrate the Jewish world into our daily life will ultimately be the arbiter of whether we're successful or not.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bejarano Gutierrez, and we hope that in the future we can have you on again to talk about philosophy, religion, or how spirituality can still be relevant. If people want to find your book, how can they get a hold of it?
They can obviously go to Amazon and just type in Secret Jews, and it will come up. As I mentioned, there's several books that I have published. And you can also visit crypto-jewisheducation.com, crypto-jewisheducation.com. I try to update that blog as much as possible, and I also try to highlight books by other authors. I recently had a review of a colleague's recently published work, and you can contact me through the blog as well. If you get one of the books, please contact me. I love to hear feedback, and I want to know what I can improve. If something's not clear, I really appreciate the engagement, and I want it to be a work that is improved on in the future. Regardless of the revisions that it takes, I want it to be sort of a living document that can be added to and improved on for the future.